January 12, 1942. The cold didn't just bite in Leningrad, it consumed. It crawled through the broken windows of the bakery on Nevsky Prospect, settled into the stone walls, and turned every breath into a visible ghost. Dmitry Volkov stood at his workbench, flour dust hanging in the dim morning light like ash from a dying fire. His hands, raw and cracked from the cold, worked the dough with a rhythm older than the war itself. But this wasn't the dough he'd known before the siege. This was something else entirely. 50 grams of sawdust, 75 grams of cottonseed cake, 125 grams of actual flour, if you could call it that. The rest was cellulose powder, swept from the floors of the old paper mill on the city's edge. Dmitry's stomach turned every time he mixed a batch, but his hands never stopped moving. They couldn't. Outside, people were dying at a rate of 4,000 a day. The siege had strangled Leningrad for 4 months now, and the only thing standing between the survivors and complete collapse was the bread that came from ovens like his. He glanced at the door. It's still dark outside. Still an hour before the queue would form that desperate line of hollow-eyed men, women, and children, clutching their ration cards like sacred texts. Dmitry had learned to arrive before dawn, to fire the ovens while the city still slept, because if he saw their faces too early, if he met their eyes before the bread was ready, he wasn't sure he could keep working. The oven door groaned as he opened it. Heat rushed out a brief mercy against the cold that made his eyes water. He slid the first tray inside, watching the misshapen loaves through the iron grate. They barely rose. The lack of proper yeast, the substitutes upon substitutes, meant the bread came out dense, gray, bitter. But it was bread. And in Leningrad, in the winter of 1942, bread was life measured out in grams. Behind him, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Dmitry didn't need to turn around. He knew the sound of those boots, of military issues. Worn, but maintained. Captain Leonid Karpov appeared in the doorway, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 kilos since October. The officer's face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows in the oven light, but his eyes still carried that particular intensity Dmitry had come to recognize in the soldiers who came for the military rations. "Good morning, Baker," Karpov said, his voice rough from the cold. "Captain." Dmitry nodded, not pausing in his work. "You're early." "So are you." "I'm always early." Karpov stepped closer, drawn by the heat of the oven like everyone else in this frozen city. He pulled off his gloves, held his hands near the warmth. "How many loaves today?" "For the soldiers? 400. For the civilians?" Dmitry's jaw tightened. 200. Maybe. The numbers hung between them like an accusation. Military rations were larger, 500 grams per day for frontline troops, 300 for support personnel. Civilians got 125 grams. Children got the same. The mathematics of survival, calculated in flour and death. "I know what you're thinking," Karpov said quietly. "Do you?" Dmitry pulled another tray from the shelf, began arranging the raw loaves with careful precision. "Because I'm thinking that the children queuing outside in an hour are going to get enough bread to fill their palms. 125 grams. That's 4 slices, if I cut them thin. And you know what that does to a child, Captain? Watching them try to make it last all day, knowing it's not enough, that tomorrow they'll be weaker, and the day after that, the soldiers are holding the line." Karpov interrupted, but there was no force behind the words. Just exhaustion. "If they fall, if the Germans break through, then we all die." Dmitry slammed the tray down harder than he meant to. "I know, I understand. The strategy, Captain. I just have to live with it every morning when I open that door." Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the oven fire. Karpov reached into his coat, pulled out a small cloth bundle. He set it on the workbench without a word. Dmitry stared at it. "What is this?" "Flour. Real flour." 2 kilos. "Where did you—" Dmitry stopped himself. "In Leningrad, you didn't ask where things came from. You just accepted that some people still had connections, still had ways of finding miracles in a city eating itself alive. I can't take this. You're not taking it. I'm ordering you to use it. Karpov's voice hardened. Mix it into the civilian rations. Make the bread a little better. Just for today. Dmitri's hands trembled as he reached for the bundle. The cloth was rough under his fingers, but inside, the flour was soft, almost forgotten in its purity. Captain, if command finds out, they won't. Karpov pulled his gloves back on. And if they do, it'll be my problem, not yours. You just make the bread, Dmitri Volkov. You keep making the bread. The captain left before Dmitri could respond, his footsteps fading into the frozen morning. Dmitri stood alone in the bakery, 2 kilos of real flour in his hands, and for the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope. Hope was too dangerous in Leningrad, but it was close. It was the possibility of doing something good in a world that had forgotten what goodness meant. He opened the bundle and began to work. 7 o'clock. The knock came precisely on time, 3 sharp raps against the bakery's front door. Dmitri wiped his hands on his apron, already stained with the gray residue of the sawdust mixture, and walked to unlock it. The cold hit him immediately, even in that brief moment between inside and out. January in Leningrad was a thing alive, predatory, patient. The queue stretched down Nevsky Prospect, farther than he could see in the morning, darkness. Bundled shapes, barely distinguishable from the snow-covered ruins around them. They stood in silence, speaking burned calories, and calories were currency more valuable than rubles now. At the front of the line, an old woman named Svetlana held her ration card with both hands, as if afraid the wind might steal it. Behind her, a young mother with a child strapped to her chest. Behind them, a teenage boy whose eyes were older than his face. Dmitri had learned not to learn their names. It hurt less that way. One at a time, he said, stepping back to let Svetlana enter. The warmth of the bakery made her gasp a sound almost obscene in its raw need. She shuffled to the counter, placed her card down with shaking fingers. Dmitri checked the date stamps, the authorization codes. Everything was in order. It was always in order. The Soviet bureaucracy might be starving, but it never stopped documenting who ate and who didn't. He reached for the bread he'd set aside, the civilian rations. But his hand hesitated. The loaves made with Karpov's flour sat on a different shelf, marked only by a small piece of chalk that meant nothing to anyone but him. 2 kilos of real flour, spread across 200 loaves. It wouldn't make them much better. Maybe 50 grams more per loaf, maybe a slightly less bitter taste. But in Leningrad, maybe it was everything. His fingers closed around one of the marked loaves. Here, he said, placing it in Svetlana's hands. She stared at it. Her eyes, roomy and exhausted, suddenly focused with an intensity that made Dmitri's chest tighten. She lifted the bread to her face, not to eat, not yet, but to smell. And in that moment, Dmitri saw something he hadn't seen in weeks. Recognition. The memory of real bread, flooding back through the simple act of scent. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were almost lost in the sound of the oven crackling behind him. "Next," Dmitri said, unable to meet her eyes. The morning passed, in the same ritual. Card. Check. Bread. Next. Each person who received one of the special loaves reacted the same way. That moment of recognition, that brief flash of something other than hunger. Dmitri marked each one in his mental ledger, knowing he couldn't do this again tomorrow, that this was a one-time mercy in an ocean of suffering. But for today, for these 200 people, the bread would be a little better. By 9 o'clock, the civilian rations were gone. The queue had thinned, but it hadn't disappeared. It never did. There were always more people than bread, more hunger than solution. Dmitri locked the front door, turned back to the kitchen, where the military rations waited proper loaves, or as proper as anything could be in this starving city. He was loading them into transport crates when the door burst open. A soldier stumbled in, younger than the war had made him look. His uniform was caked in frost, and something darker blood frozen into his sleeve. His eyes were wild, searching, desperate. "Baker," he gasped, "the warehouse, the grain warehouse on Volkov Street, it's burning." Dmitri froze. "What?" "Shells. German artillery. Direct hit an hour ago. The grain." The soldier couldn't finish. He didn't need to. Every person in Leningrad knew what that meant. The grain warehouses were the last significant stores of food in the city. If one was burning, if the grain was lost, how bad? Dmitri's voice came out steady, though his hands had started shaking. "Bad. Maybe 10,000 kilos, maybe more." The soldier leaned against the doorframe, exhausted. "Command is trying to salvage what they can, but 10,000 kilos. Enough for 20,000 people for a day, or 10,000 people for 2 days. The mathematics of starvation, recalculated in real time." Dmitri looked at the military rations, neatly stacked and waiting for transport. Then he looked at the soldier, 17 or 18 years old, wearing a uniform that couldn't keep out the cold and carrying a rifle to hold back an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. "Take what you need," Dmitri said quietly. "Get the bread to the front." The soldier nodded, moved to grab the crates. But he paused, turned back. "The civilians outside. Do they know?" "Not yet." Dmitri met his eyes. "But they will. Everyone always knows. Eventually." The soldier left with the military rations. Dmitri stood in the empty bakery, the ovens cooling, the flour gone. Outside, he could hear new voices joining the queue, people who'd heard about the warehouse, who were coming to secure their rations before the news spread further. And tomorrow? Tomorrow the rations will be smaller, maybe 100 grams instead of 125, maybe less. He thought about Karpov's flour, about those 200 people who'd gotten something a little better today. At the time, it had felt like a victory. Now, it felt like a lie, a beautiful, necessary lie told in the language of bread. The knock came again at the door. 3 sharp raps. Dmitri took a deep breath, wiped his hands on his apron, and went to let them in. February 8, 1942. 27 days since the warehouse burned. 27 days of watching the rations shrink, of mixing more sawdust into less flour, of seeing the queue outside grow longer even as the people in it grew weaker. Dmitri's hands moved through the familiar motions: mix, knead, shape, bake. But the muscle memory couldn't erase what he saw every morning when he opened the door. They were dying, standing up now. Some would make it to the front of the queue and simply collapse, the ration cards still clutched in frozen fingers. Others would receive their bread, turn to leave, and not make it past the doorway. The cold and hunger worked together, a perfect machine of death that ground through the city day by day, person by person. Dmitri had stopped trying not to learn their names. It didn't make it easier. Nothing made it easier. "Dmitri." The voice came from behind him, sharp with urgency. He turned to find Captain Karpov in the doorway, but the man had changed. Even in the 4 weeks since Dmitri had last seen him, the captain looked skeletal. His cheekbones jutted like knife edges, and his hands trembled even when he wasn't cold. "Captain." Dmitri set down his mixing bowl. "I wasn't expecting you. I need to talk to you." Karpov glanced at the door to the front room, where the queue waited. Privately, they stepped into the back storage area, such as it was empty shelves that had once held sacks of grain, now home to nothing but dust and the smell of old flour. Karpov pulled the door shut behind them, leaned against it as if he might fall without the support. "There's a problem," Karpov said. "With the flour I gave you in January." Dmitri's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" The quartermaster noticed a discrepancy. 2 kilos unaccounted for. "He's investigating." Karpov's eyes met Dmitri's, and in them was something Dmitri hadn't seen before. Fear. "If he traces it back to me, if he finds out I diverted military supplies." "You gave it to the civilians," Dmitri finished. "That's a court-martial offense. It's a firing squad offense." Karpov laughed, bitter and hollow. "Sabotage, undermining the military effort." They've shot officers for less during the siege. The words hung in the cold air between them. Dmitri thought about those 200 loaves, about Svetlana's face when she smelled real flour, about the teenage boy who'd eaten his ration slowly, savoring each bite as if it were his last meal. And now all of that, every moment of mercy, was a death sentence waiting to be signed. "What do we do?" Dmitri asked. "We?" Karpov shook his head. "There is no we. This is my responsibility. I just needed you to know, in case they come asking questions, tell them I stole it. Tell them you didn't know what I was doing. I can't. You can, and you will." Karpov pushed off from the door, stood as straight as his weakened body would allow. "You have a job to do here, Baker. People need you. The soldiers need you. You don't get to throw that away because I made a choice." Before Dmitri could respond, the door to the front room opened. A new figure stepped through, a man in the dark uniform of the NKVD, the secret police. His face was well-fed, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. Behind him, 2 more officers, both carrying rifles. "Captain Leonid Karpov," the NKVD officer said, his voice flat and bureaucratic. "You are under arrest for theft of military property and sabotage of the war effort. Come with us." Karpov didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. He simply nodded, turned to follow them. But at the door, he paused, glanced back at Dmitri. "Keep making the bread," he said quietly. "No matter what happens, keep making the bread." Then he was gone, flanked by the NKVD officers, disappearing into the frozen morning. Dmitri stood alone in the storage room, surrounded by empty shelves and the ghost of real flour. And for the first time since the siege began, he wept. Not for Karpov, not for himself, but for what the war had made of kindness a crime punishable by death. February 14th, 1942. Valentine's Day, though no one in Leningrad had the strength or the heart to remember such things. Dmitri stood outside the military courthouse on Fontanka Street, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. He'd been summoned as a witness. Not asked. Summoned. The NKVD didn't request. They commanded. The building was one of the few in Leningrad still properly heated, powered by a generator the military had prioritized above hospitals, above schools, above everything except the defense of the city. Inside, warmth hit Dmitri like a physical blow. His fingers, numb from the walk, began to tingle painfully as blood returned to them. A guard directed him to a waiting room, bare except for a wooden bench and a portrait of Stalin, watching from the wall with those dark, knowing eyes. Dmitri sat and waited. An hour passed, maybe more. Time felt different inside these walls, insulated from the hunger and cold that governed the rest of the city. Finally, the door opened, and a different guard beckoned him forward. "The tribunal is ready for you." The courtroom was small, efficient, designed for quick judgments rather than prolonged deliberation. 3 officers sat at a raised bench, judges, though Dmitri knew their verdict had been decided before the trial began. In the center of the room, standing at attention despite his obvious weakness, was Captain Karpov. He'd been cleaned up for the trial, his uniform pressed, but nothing could hide the way the fabric hung on his diminished frame. Karpov's eyes found Dmitri's. There was no plea in them, no desperation, just a quiet acceptance, and beneath it, something that might have been peace. "Witness Dmitri Alexandrovich Volkov," the presiding officer announced. "You are the baker who received stolen military property from the defendant?" "I received flour from Captain Karpov," Dmitri said carefully. "I didn't know it was stolen." "But you used it?" "Yes. For what purpose?" Dmitri hesitated. The truth would change nothing. Karpov was already condemned, but lies had a weight all their own, and Dmitri found he couldn't carry another one. "I used it to improve the civilian rations. For 1 day. 200 loaves. I mixed it in to make the bread a little better." A murmur ran through the small gallery of observers, other soldiers, NKVD personnel, functionaries whose job was to witness and report. The presiding officer leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You knowingly diverted military resources to civilians during a time of siege warfare?" "Captain Karpov ordered me to do it," Dmitri said. It wasn't quite a lie. Karpov had told him to use the flour. The rest, the choice of who received it, how it was distributed, that had been Dmitri's own decision. "I was following an officer's instructions." The presiding officer exchanged glances with his colleagues. For a moment, Dmitri thought he saw something in their faces, not sympathy, exactly, but perhaps recognition. They were hungry too. Not starving like the civilians, not dying at a rate of 4,000 per day, but hungry. They understood what 2 kilos of real flour meant in a city eating sawdust and cellulose. "Captain Karpov," the officer said, turning his attention back to the defendant, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Karpov straightened, looking directly at his judges. "I gave the baker 2 kilos of flour and instructed him to use it for civilian rations. I did this knowing it was against military regulations. I did it because those civilians, those children, are what we're fighting for. If we lose sight of that, if we become a military machine that only feeds itself while the people starve, then we've already lost this war. Not to the Germans, to ourselves." Silence filled the courtroom. It was the kind of silence that preceded executions, that hung in the air before bullets found their marks. Dmitri's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. The presiding officer stood. "Captain Leonid Ivanovich Karpov, this tribunal finds you guilty of theft of military property and misappropriation of resources during wartime. Under normal circumstances, this offense carries a penalty of execution by firing squad." Dmitri's heart stopped. "However," the officer continued, and there was something almost reluctant in his voice, "these are not normal circumstances. Leningrad is under siege. Every soldier, every officer, every person capable of defending this city is needed. Therefore, this tribunal sentences you to reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of pay, and immediate transfer to frontline infantry duty. You will serve with the 42nd Army on the Ladoga, the defensive line, until such time as the siege is lifted or you are incapacitated." It wasn't mercy. Frontline duty in Leningrad was a slower death sentence, death by attrition rather than immediate bullet. But it was life, at least for now. And in Leningrad, life was everything. Karpov nodded once, accepting the judgment without protest. As the guards moved to escort him out, he turned to Dmitri one final time. "Keep making the bread," he said again. And then he was gone. Dmitri left the courthouse and walked back through the frozen streets to his bakery. The queue was already forming despite the early hour ghosts in the cold, waiting for their 100 grams of survival. He unlocked the door, lit the ovens, and began to mix the dough. Sawdust, cottonseed, cellulose, the minimum amount of flour to hold it all together. His hands moved through the familiar motions, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about Karpov's words. If we lose sight of that, if we become a machine that only feeds itself, then we've already lost. Dmitri looked at the dough beneath his hands, gray and lifeless. Then he looked at the small hidden compartment in his workbench, the place where he'd been hoarding his own rations, saving them for a day when he might be too weak to work. Inside was perhaps half a kilo of flour, real flour, his insurance against starvation. He pulled it out, held it in his hands. Then he poured it into the mixing bowl and watched it disappear into the gray mass. It wasn't enough to make a difference for everyone. Maybe 20 loaves would be slightly better. Maybe 40 people would taste something real in their bread. But it was something. And in Leningrad, something was everything. The oven was hot, the dough was ready, the queue was waiting. Dmitri Volkov opened the door and began to work. April 20th, 1942. Spring came to Leningrad not with flowers or warmth, but with corpses. As the snow melted, it revealed the bodies of those who'd fallen during the winter, thousands of them, frozen and preserved, now exposed to the weak sun. The city organized collection teams. but there were too many dead and too few living to gather them all. Leningrad smelled of death and mud, and the promise of something that wasn't quite hope but was closer than anything they'd felt in months. The siege hadn't been lifted. The Germans still surrounded the city, still shelled it daily, still squeezed it in their grip. But the road of life across Lake Ladoga was fully operational now, and supplies were coming in. Not enough. Never enough. But more than before. The ration had increased to 200 grams for civilians. A miracle measured in bread. Dmitri stood at his workbench, mixing dough that contained actual grain, not just sawdust and substitutes, but real wheat flour in quantities he hadn't seen since before the war. His hands, scarred from months of cold and hard work, moved with a precision born of necessity. The queue outside was smaller now. Some people had died, some had been evacuated, but those who remained still came each morning, still clutched their ration cards, still waited for the bread that kept them alive. The door opened behind him. Dmitri didn't turn immediately, expecting another early customer or perhaps one of the supply officers checking his inventory. But the footsteps were wrong, hesitant, shuffling, heavy with exhaustion. Baker. Dmitri turned. For a moment, he didn't recognize the figure in the doorway. The man wore a private's uniform, torn and stained with mud and blood. His face was gaunt to the point of skeletal, one arm bound in dirty bandages, and he leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a rifle stock. But the eyes were familiar. "Captain?" Dmitri whispered, then corrected himself. "Karpov?" Not a captain anymore. Karpov's voice was rough, damaged by cold and smoke and things Dmitri couldn't imagine. "Just Leonid now. Or private, if you want to be formal about it." Dmitri crossed the room, helped Karpov to a stool near the oven. Up close, he could see the damaged shrapnel scars on the man's neck, frostbite damage on his exposed fingers, and something in his eyes that spoke of horrors witnessed and survived. "I thought that I was dead?" Karpov laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "Nearly. 3 times, actually. German assault on the 15th of March. Sniper on the 23rd. Artillery barrage last week. But the universe, it seems, has a sense of humor." Dmitri didn't know what to say. What words could possibly address what Karpov had endured? Instead, he did what he knew how to do. He went to the oven, pulled out a fresh loaf, one of the better ones, made with the new supplies, and brought it back. "Here, eat." Karpov took the bread with his good hand, stared at it, as if seeing something sacred. He tore off a piece, slowly, carefully, and brought it to his nose. That same gesture Dmitri had seen from Svetlana months ago, that moment of recognition. "Real bread," Karpov said softly. "Real bread," Dmitri confirmed. They sat in silence while Karpov ate. Not quickly, despite the obvious hunger. Each bite was deliberate, savored, a meditation on survival. When half the loaf was gone, he stopped, wrapped the rest carefully in a cloth. "For later," he explained. "Old habits." "You're wounded," Dmitri observed. "They must have discharged you. Medical leave. 2 weeks. Then back to the line, if I can walk by then." Karpov shifted his weight, winced at some pain Dmitri couldn't see. "But I wanted to come here first, to see if you were still alive, to see if any of this mattered." It mattered. The words came out more forcefully than Dmitri intended. "Those 200 people you helped feed in January? Some of them are still alive. I see them in the queue. Svetlana, the old woman who was first in line that day, she's still here, still coming for her ration. And the teenage boy, Alexei, he joined the Komsomol Youth Brigade. He helps dig defensive positions." Karpov looked up, something like emotion crossing his ravaged face. "They survived. Some of them. Not all. Never all." Dmitri returned to his workbench, began kneading a new batch of dough. "But the ones who made it, they had your flour in their bellies. Maybe that made the difference. Maybe it didn't. But they remember. I remember." "I nearly got you killed," Karpov said quietly. "The tribunal, the investigation, You showed me that kindness still exists. Dmitri shaped the dough with practiced hands, forming loaves that would feed the living and honor the dead. In a city where people eat wallpaper paste and carpenter's glue to survive, where mothers watch their children starve and can do nothing, where death is so common, it becomes mundane, you showed me that we can still choose to be human. That matters more than you know. Karpov stood, slowly, painfully, using his crutch for support. He walked to the workbench, watched Dmitri work. "Keep making the bread," he said, and this time it wasn't an order or a final request. It was simply a truth, acknowledged between two men who'd survived something that shouldn't be survivable. "I will," Dmitri promised. "As long as they need it, I'll make the bread." Karpov nodded, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "The war will end eventually, Baker, and when it does, when people ask what we did during the siege, I hope they remember this, that we fed each other, that we kept each other alive, sometimes one loaf at a time." Then he was gone, limping back into the spring morning, back toward whatever future waited for a broken soldier in a starving city. Dmitri stood alone in his bakery, hands deep in dough, and felt something he hadn't felt in months: gratitude. Not for the war, not for the suffering, but for the chance to have mattered, to have made a difference in ways large and small. The bread beneath his hands would feed perhaps 30 people today. Tomorrow he'd make more. And the day after that, more still. Outside, the queue was forming. 3 sharp knocks came at the door, the signal that the morning had begun. Dmitri wiped his hands, checked the ovens, and took a deep breath. Then he opened the door and let them in.